You've just woken up in Victorian England. Congrats! You're a woman now. No job, no property, no voice, but hey, here's a bonnet and a lifetime of childbirth. Hope you like sewing. Born to be a burden. So, you're born in 1830s England. Congratulations. If you're a girl, your life plan just came pre-installed. Childhood? Short? Rights? None. Expectations? Endless. From day one, your gender makes you the family's emotional support servant. No one's saving for your future. You're not going to Oxford. You're learning how to hem a petticoat and pour tea without spilling. By age 5, you're expected to be quiet, sweet, and invisible. Crying too much? Too sensitive. Talking too much? Too wild. Reading too much? Dangerous. That's how you end up with a doll in your hand instead of a book in your lap. School? Maybe. If you're working class, it's a one-room charity school where you'll learn the alphabet and how to stitch under supervision. Middle class? You might get a governess. But don't expect history or science. You'll study music, embroidery, French, and how to not faint during dinner parties. Upper class? You still don't get out of this. You're being trained to marry well, not think hard. Meanwhile, your brother's learning Latin and law. You're learning how to smile politely while dying inside. If you're poor, there's a good chance you'll skip school entirely and head straight to the factory. Girls worked in textile mills, matchstick plants, or as house servants. Some were apprenticed by age 10, which is Victorian for "we sold her labor to a stranger." Sick? Suck it up. No one's calling a doctor for a girl unless she's actively dying or important to a man's reputation. By the time you're 13, you're either working full-time or prepping to be married off. At 14, many girls were considered ready for engagement. Consent laws barely existed. In 1830, the age of consent was 12. Yes, 12. But don't worry, your future includes lots of childbirth, limited hygiene, and almost no autonomy. That's girlhood in the 1830s. Short, silent, and sold off early. But hey, at least you've got a bonnet. Educated, but not too much. It's the 1840s. Time to get an education, if you're lucky, rich, or male. If you're a girl, you get just enough schooling to make you pleasant, not powerful. The idea of educating women scared the life out of Victorian society. Too much reading might ruin your morals. Too much thinking might damage your womb. Schools for girls existed, sure, but they weren't built for intellect. They were built to turn you into a wife. Employers wouldn't laugh at. Typical curriculum: sewing, music, drawing, and something called accomplishments. That meant you could play the piano and look good doing it. Algebra? Don't even ask. Chemistry? Not unless you plan to blow up your marriage prospects. Working-class girls, meanwhile, didn't even get that much. Most couldn't afford books, let alone tuition. Charity schools and ragged schools popped up across cities like London and Manchester, but they were overcrowded and underfunded. Classes were short, basic, and always gendered. Boys learned trades. Girls learned housework. And don't even think about university. Women weren't allowed into Oxford or Cambridge. They couldn't even sit in the same room as male students. The idea of a woman in a lecture hall? That was comedy material in 1845. Even the few women who dared to push through, like Elizabeth Blackwell, who later became the first female doctor, were treated like freaks. Professors mocked them. Students shunned them. Newspapers warned about the dangerous rise of educated females. Meanwhile, smart girls had to hide behind male pen names just to be taken seriously. Ever heard of Mary Ann Evans? No? That's because she had to write as George Eliot to get published. So yes, Victorian England allowed women to learn, just not too much. Enough to sing a ballad, sketch a flower, and write a polite thank you note, but never enough to outsmart the men in charge. Brains weren't banned, they were just considered inconvenient. The legal identity of no one. In the 1850s England, getting married meant legally disappearing. The second you said "I do," the law said you don't. Coverture made it official. Husbands absorbed their wives like legal black holes. Any money you had, any property you inherited, even wages from your own work, gone. Your husband had full control. You couldn't sue, sign contracts, or own anything in your own name. You were the property. He could take your jewelry and sell your family land. He didn't need your permission. He didn't even have to tell you. Once married, you had fewer rights than a single man's dog. Trying to leave? That was worse. Before 1857, divorce required a private act of parliament. After 1857, the new Matrimonial Causes Act let people apply for civil divorce. But men had it easy. Women had to prove adultery and cruelty, incest, bigamy, or desertion. And even then, most judges sided with the husband. Leave him, and he keeps the children. English law treated kids as his by default. Even if he was abusive, absent, or dangerous, you'd need a legal miracle to win custody. And no, You couldn't just slip away and start over. Divorce trials were public. Newspapers published every detail, often mocking women as hysterical or immoral. The stigma could destroy your social standing, even if you were the victim. One woman, Caroline Norton, spent years trying to change that. Her husband cut her off financially, blocked her from seeing their children, and stole her writing income, all legally. Her fight helped lead to the Custody of Infants Act, 1839, and future reforms, but even she couldn't undo the damage in her own life. Reproduction without rights. In Victorian England, having a uterus came with rules, none of which you wrote. The government didn't just ignore women's reproductive rights, it actively erased them. The 1861 Offenses Against the Person Act made it a criminal offense to seek or perform any procedure intended to end a pregnancy. Even publishing information about birth control was banned under the Obscene Publications Act. One publisher was sentenced to prison for printing a basic guide to contraception. Options were limited. Condoms existed, but they were expensive, unreliable, and mostly marketed to men avoiding disease, not fathers avoiding another mouth to feed. Diaphragms and sponges were underground at best. Doctors rarely discussed them. Husbands weren't expected to care. Pregnancy wasn't a choice, it was a certainty. Women were expected to bear children constantly, whether they wanted to or not. A wife's consent didn't matter. Consent in marriage wasn't legally recognized. A husband had full access to his wife, no questions asked. Childbirth was brutal. Hospitals were overcrowded and often filthy. Home births were more common, especially for the poor, but no safer. There were no antibiotics, no sterile tools. Childbed fever, an infection caused by unwashed hands, killed thousands. Pain relief was controversial. When Queen Victoria used chloroform in 1853 during the birth of her 8th child, conservative leaders accused her of undermining divine punishment. Yes, easing pain was considered suspicious. Being a mother wasn't a sacred role. It was unpaid labor with no rights and no rest. You brought life into the world, over and over, with little say in the matter and less help when it went wrong. Motherhood didn't elevate you, it confined you, permanently. Sick, sad, and sent to the asylum. Feeling sad? Moody? Too outspoken? In the 1860s England, that could land you in an asylum. Victorian medicine wasn't kind to women, especially those who didn't behave. The most common diagnosis wasn't depression, anxiety, or trauma. It was hysteria. The cure? Institutionalization. Hysteria was a catch-all term for anything that made men uncomfortable. Crying too often? Hysteria. Refusing your husband's advances? Hysteria. Reading novels? Being unmarried past 30? Or speaking your mind? You guessed it. Women could be committed for things as vague as nervous excitement or melancholia. There didn't need to be a medical review. A husband, father, or even a brother could simply sign the paperwork. Once inside, getting out was a different story. Conditions in asylums ranged from bad to horrific. The treatment might include isolation, cold baths, forced feeding, or something called the rest cure, total sensory deprivation for weeks. No books, no talking, no visitors. Just you, a bed, and silence. Designed to calm you down, usually just broke you. Doctors like Silas Weir Mitchell, famous for prescribing the rest cure, claimed it could fix women who were overstimulated. In reality, it left many worse than before. Charlotte Perkins Gilman later wrote The Yellow Wallpaper based on her own experience with it. That was fiction, but not by much. For working-class women, it was worse. Poor facilities, overcrowding, and zero privacy. If you acted out or resisted, physical punishment was standard. Straitjackets weren't rare. Electroshock therapy started showing up by the 1870s, with zero consent required. Most women weren't dangerous. They were just inconvenient. Some were grieving mothers. Others were victims of abuse. A few were simply too smart for their time and didn't hide it well enough. If you were lucky, you got released after a few months. If not, you disappeared for life. No trial, no appeal, just gone. Mental illness was real. But in Victorian England, being a woman was often diagnosis enough. You didn't need to be mad. You just needed to be inconvenient. And if your husband had money, a doctor, and a signed paper, that was enough to make your thoughts someone else's property. Work, but don't call it a career. By the 1860s, women were everywhere in the workforce and almost nowhere in the conversation. With industrialization booming, factories needed hands. Women and girls filled the gaps. Textile mills, match factories, laundries, paper plants, all packed with female labor. The pay? Miserable. Hours? Endless. Safety? Not even a talking point. Matchstick girls in London worked with white phosphorus. It caused something called phossy jaw, a painful, disfiguring condition that slowly destroyed the jawbone and left lasting damage. And still, they kept working. There were no sick days. If you couldn't work, you didn't eat. Domestic service was the top job for women. In 1871, nearly 40% of employed women were maids, cooks, or housekeepers. These weren't Downton Abbey gigs. You lived where you worked, had no privacy, and answered bells from dawn till midnight. Sundays off? Sometimes. But only if the family didn't host guests. Middle-class women had a different problem. Working wasn't just difficult, it was scandalous. A woman with a job was seen as a social failure, especially if she was unmarried. Respectable ladies weren't supposed to need money, they were supposed to marry it. Teaching was one of the few acceptable careers for them, but even that was tricky. Headmistress positions were rare. Pay was half what men earned, at best. And once you married, many employers made you quit. Because clearly, you couldn't possibly teach and be a wife. Professional careers were nearly impossible. Medicine? Closed. Law? Forget it. Journalism? Only under a fake name. Women who tried were either mocked, ignored, or blocked entirely. It wasn't until 1865 that Elizabeth Garrett Anderson finally became the first woman licensed to practice medicine in the UK, and she had to fight every step of the way. And if you thought being self-employed gave you freedom, think again. Married women couldn't legally own their earnings. So even if you ran your own business, the profits belonged to your husband. You built it, he owned it. Victorian women worked everywhere. Factories, kitchens, classrooms, homes, but were never treated as professionals. They weren't credited, weren't respected, and almost never promoted. Because in this era, women didn't have careers. They had jobs. Until they got married, then they had chores. Writing behind pseudonyms. Think you're clever? In Victorian England, that was a problem if you were a woman. Brilliant women didn't just face rejection, they were ignored outright. The intellectual world treated them like background noise. If you wanted to be taken seriously, you had to pretend to be a man. Mary Ann Evans knew this. That's why she wrote as George Eliot. Her novels, Middlemarch, The Mill on the Floss, are considered literary masterpieces. But at the time, no one would have read them if she'd used her real name. Critics actually praised George for writing with unexpected sensitivity. Oof! She wasn't alone. The Bronte sisters started their careers under the names Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. Charlotte, Emily, and Anne knew their books would be dismissed as women's fiction before a single page was turned. So, they lied, and only after they had proven success did they reveal their identities. And it wasn't just fiction. Women writing politics, science, or journalism had to work around the system. Many published anonymously. Others had their work stolen or credited to male editors. Meanwhile, universities were slowly, very slowly, opening their doors. In 1869, Girton College was founded as the first women's college at Cambridge. But female students still couldn't earn degrees. They could study, take exams, even outperform male classmates, but no diploma. Women who pushed for more were treated like they had a disease. Critics warned that too much learning would masculinize women. Medical journals claimed education could damage fertility. Some even argued that thinking too hard would cause the uterus to shrink. Yes, really. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson and Sophia Jex-Blake fought for years to enter medical school. They faced mockery, boycotts, even physical threats. Anderson had to get her license through a loophole. Jex-Blake started her own school just to train other women. So while men debated politics, explored science, and wrote history, women were left whispering in the margins, or writing under fake names just to be heard. The mind wasn't off limits to Victorian women. It was just ignored unless it wore a mustache. Votes? You must be joking. Politics in Victorian England wasn't just a boys' club. It was sealed like a vault, and women didn't even get the combination. By the 1870s, reform movements were gaining traction. Men were demanding broader voting rights and representation. Women? Still waiting to be recognized as citizens. They could pay taxes, run charities, and raise the next generation of lawmakers, but they couldn't vote for any of them. In 1866, over 1,500 women signed a petition demanding suffrage. Parliament's response? A polite shrug. The document was presented, debated briefly, then shelved like a bad dinner suggestion. The logic went like this. Women were too emotional, too delicate, or too busy with housework to understand politics. Giving them the vote, some claimed, would upset the natural order. One MP even warned it could lead to women joining Parliament. Gasp. Meanwhile, working women had no voice in the laws that affected their jobs, homes, or children. Rich widows had more legal power than married women, and still couldn't vote. The system didn't just ignore women, it erased them. A few cracks began to show. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 gave wives the right to keep earnings and property in their own names. It was slow progress, but a shift nonetheless. And yet, actual political power stayed out of reach. Even involvement in activism came with risk. Women who protested could be arrested, fired, or blacklisted. Social circles closed ranks around troublemakers. Leaders like Lydia Becker and Josephine Butler started organizing, giving speeches, and publishing pamphlets. Butler fought especially hard against the Contagious Diseases Acts, which allowed police to forcibly examine women suspected of prostitution. No evidence required, no trial, just accusation. These laws didn't apply to men, of course, just the women they paid. By the late 1880s, women's suffrage groups were everywhere, but still shut out of actual politics. They could lobby, they could march, but they couldn't vote on the issues that shaped their own lives. Being politically active as a woman meant speaking loudly into a locked door, and the men inside weren't listening. The double standard. Victorian morality loved one thing above all else: control, especially over women's bodies. By the 1880s, being respectable meant one thing for women: pure, quiet, modest, and married. For men, not even close. Male promiscuity was dismissed as natural. Female sexuality was scandalous, even in marriage. Respectable women were expected to be chaste before marriage and obedient afterward. Sex was considered a duty, not a right. Desire? Unspoken. Consent? Not legally recognized. The law didn't recognize consent within marriage. A husband had the legal right to access his wife's body anytime, no matter what. Outside of marriage, things got worse. The Contagious Diseases Acts, passed in the 1860s and still enforced into the 1880s, gave police sweeping power to arrest women suspected of prostitution. No trial, no warrant. These women were then subjected to forced internal exams, often in filthy, painful conditions. Refuse, and you could be jailed. Comply, and you were humiliated and labeled unclean. Meanwhile, the men visiting brothels faced no punishment at all. Josephine Butler led the charge to repeal these laws. She called them what they were: state-sanctioned abuse. It took 16 years, but her campaign worked. The acts were finally repealed in 1886. But the mindset remained. Fallen women, anyone who had sex outside marriage, were ruined socially. There were no second chances. If you were seduced, or just unlucky, society erased your respectability and closed its doors. Some women ended up in Magdalene laundries, working unpaid labor for the rest of their lives to atone. Men who did the same? Promoted, pitied, or praised. A man with a mistress was just being a man. A woman with a past was a cautionary tale. Double standard didn't even begin to cover it. Men got reputations, women got ruined. By the end of the century, there were whispers of reform. New women's groups were forming. Ideas about equality were creeping in, but public morality still kept women boxed into silence. In Victorian England, respect wasn't earned, it was rationed, and men held the key. You can nurse, but don't operate. By the 1890s, women were finally being praised for their work in medicine, as long as they stuck to nursing and stayed out of surgery. Nursing had become a respectable job for women, thanks mostly to Florence Nightingale, who dragged it out of the gutter during the Crimean War. Before her reforms, nurses were often untrained, drunk, or both. Nightingale professionalized the field: uniforms, discipline, and a new reputation for moral cleanliness. But don't mistake praise for progress. Nurses were still considered assistants, not medical professionals. They bathed patients, cleaned floors, changed linens. Doctors, always men, gave the orders. Women followed them. Trying to become a doctor? That was still a war zone. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson broke ground by becoming the first woman in Britain to qualify as a physician. But she had to fight the system every step of the way. Medical schools denied her entry. Male students boycotted classes. Professors tried to fail her out on principle. She eventually earned her license through the Society of Apothecaries, a loophole that the group quickly closed afterward. Anderson went on to found her own hospital for women and children because no one else would let her practice. Sophia Jex-Blake faced similar barriers. She led a group known as the Edinburgh Seven, the first women to study medicine at a British university. They were heckled, blocked from exams, and physically attacked by mobs of male students. After years of fighting, the university refused to grant their degrees. Jex-Blake later helped open the London School of Medicine for women, creating a path for future female doctors. But public opinion was still hostile. Newspapers warned that female doctors would lose their femininity. Some claimed surgery was too violent for a woman's delicate nature. Others said medical education might damage her ability to have children. And yet, by the end of the century, women kept pushing forward, qualifying, practicing, and finally being recognized. Slowly, grudgingly. They could care for the sick, they could study anatomy, but even with spotless records and years of training, they were still asked, "Are you sure this is appropriate?" Victorian medicine was fine with women saving lives, as long as they didn't try to lead.